Hey, howdy, what is up? And welcome back to my channel. My name's Emily, and I make writing and bookish content here on YouTube. It is officially September, which means it's time to talk about what books I read in August. I haven't been doing wrap-ups and TBRs super frequently because what I read just changes so frequently. I end up not reading what I put on my TBR a lot of the time, but anyway, I'm gonna talk about what I did read in August of 2023. Honestly, it's not a super impressive list. It's not that many books, but that is okay. And if you are wondering if it is okay for you to have read less than 20 books in a month, I'm going to tell you right now that it is okay. Reading is not a race, it should be enjoyed, and let's not judge each other based on how much or how little we read. Okay, so moving on from that little tangent, I want to talk about what books I did read in August. Now, overall, I would say it was a weird month for reading for me. I had gotten really busy at work and working on my book that's coming out in a couple weeks, and so I just kind of reading took a back seat for a while. But I normally don't do wrap-ups, and I wanted to do one this month because it had been a while and I read some really good books. So let's talk about it. The first book that I finished this month was called Gathering Moss, which I listened to on audiobook, and this is by the same author of Braiding Sweetgrass. And if you don't remember, I read that book earlier this year, I think, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books maybe ever. Definitely one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. Gathering Moss was similar in some ways, but also very different in other ways. Overall, this book did focus a lot on moss and only moss alone, versus I think Braiding Sweetgrass really covered a variety of topics and more life and science in general and how that kind of intertwines with her indigenous practices. This was a lot more just about moss and then talking about, you know, the scientific basis of it and how like you can preserve it naturally and how moss grows and develops, and it was very, very scientifically based and I really loved it. I think I would have preferred reading it in hand than listening to it on audiobook, although I will say Robin, the author, did do the audiobook, so it was really cool hearing her voice talking about her life stories. That I think was a really cool perk of listening to it on audiobook. However, I think because of how scientific it all is, I think I would have had a better, easier time grasping the information if I was reading it versus only listening to it. But that is just me. My ratings, my star ratings for books are vibes alone. So honestly, take my star ratings with a grain of salt. So even though my star ratings are like kind of arbitrary, I did end up giving this one 4.5 stars, which I think feels right. I really did enjoy the book. I think I just would have enjoyed it. I would have been a little bit more immersed in it if it had been. And it just didn't live up to Braiding Sweetgrass, but I think Braiding Sweetgrass like really set the bar high. It was so good. But yeah, I'll just leave that one there. The next book I've read is Us Against You, which is the sequel to Beartown, which I did a whole review for. So if you haven't read Beartown yet and you want to know what that's about, I will link it up above and down below. Us Against You kind of picks off almost immediately where the last one did. Like a lot of sequels in book series, I ended up liking the first one a little bit more. It had like middle book syndrome for me, I think. There is a third one called The Winners, and I am interested in reading that one. I mean, by all means, this book was awesome, and I really enjoyed the story, and I love that we elaborated more on the characters. While Beartown was a lot about a town fighting over this horrible thing that happened, this one focuses a lot more on like homophobia and hatred and violence and like gang violence, actually, which was a very interesting take because with a lot of these small towns, especially like in Sweden, at least for me, you don't picture gang violence or things like that in these small towns. So it was a very interesting perspective, and I really did enjoy the story. I did end up giving this one 4 stars because I really enjoyed it. I will say it kind of made me a little slumpy though. But once I pushed through and I kept reading it, it really picked up again. Versus like Beartown, I'm pretty sure I finished in a day because I just couldn't stop reading. So a little bit different than the first one, but I still really loved it, and I am very much looking forward to seeing how he wraps it up in the third one. The next book I read, but actually listened to on audiobook, was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix, and this is the author of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Yeah, it's that author. So this book, the concept is what really drew me to it. It takes place in like a sort of IKEA store. There have been some peculiar things happening around the store, and the manager asks our main character, she will stay overnight along with another employee to kind of investigate what's going on because they think people are coming into the store and like robbing them and moving furniture around. and like the cameras are all conveniently turned off, so he's like, I want to know what's going on, and let's stay the night and figure it out. And so she agrees because she wants the extra money, I think. And Grady Hendrix writing, because I noticed this in the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires as well, there's like this sort of levity to a lot of his work, which I find really refreshing in the horror genre, where you kind of have this, you have very gruesome things going on, but there's always like, I feel like there's a bit of humor to it all at the same time, but not in like a haha funny way. I don't really know how to describe it. But I feel like that was definitely a part of this book, which I appreciated. Honestly though, for me, it got pretty boring, and I only gave it 3 stars, but it's probably sitting at like 2.5 for me. I think for me, it was boring. I was listening to it on audiobook, so maybe it would have been different if I had been reading it in my hands, but I just couldn't really care about what was going on. There's a lot of gore in this book as well, or I will say Grady has a way with descriptions that like makes me like burst out sweating or like grinding my teeth because I'm like, what is going on? I will say, if you are into like really graphic horror in a way, or like body horror, I feel like it was a lot of body horror, but that could be wrong. I will say like that was definitely a big part of this book, but it was interesting overall, but it didn't stand out to me as being great. That's why it kind of sits where it is. But I am glad that I read it. Next book I read was A Dowry of Blood, which I have been so excited for since, I don't know, forever, because Dracula is probably my favorite classic of all time. I'm interested to see how I feel about this book after I've also reread Dracula in October, but I'm not sure. Basically, it's fairly short, and it's written as an open letter to Dracula from his first wife, Constantina. I can say her name, from his first wife, Constantina. And if you have read the original Dracula, you know that he has these 3 brides. So this was very interesting because that's pretty much where the connections to the original classic book kind of end. This book definitely takes its own sort of path. And I that doesn't bother me, and I did overall enjoy it. I loved the very floral, elegant writing of the author. Read like old Victorian letters or whatever. I mean, at least to me it did. I think some people think that it was a little bit too self-grandizing or something like that. I don't know if that's the right word. It's interesting that this won Best Horror on Goodreads, because to me it was not horror, but maybe it's just because of the amount of blood and killing in it, I suppose. I don't know like what classifies something as horror. Like, this didn't seem like a scary book to me whatsoever. But it was a very beautifully written tale, and if you're someone who likes vampires in a more classical sense of the vampires, like living in the 1800s, this is definitely one that would be probably a good pick for you. So the book kind of spans across hundreds of years because vampires are immortal, obviously. I love that the people in the book all had agency in their own way. All of the characters were very unique and different. Those are things that I particularly like when I'm reading a book. I want them all to be very particular in my mind and be able to be placed in a certain way, and this book definitely did that. I will say there was a lot more sex in it than I thought there would be, because I wasn't really expecting it. But I think that's on me. I think I was supposed to expect it, and it just took me by surprise. But that could be me. But anyway, I gave this book 4 stars. It was very beautiful. I think on a reread, I might get more out of it, and especially, you know, reading it after maybe rereading Dracula or something along those lines, maybe I'll get something more out of it that way as well. In terms of, like, autumnal feelings, that this book definitely gives me a lot of the same feelings that I look for when I want to read, like, a vampire book in the autumn or the fall. And yeah, I enjoyed it. It's so weird. I like don't have anything like specific to say about it because I want to keep everything I talk about fairly spoiler free. The next book I read in August was Cytonic by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd in the Skyward series, and this is the longest book so far in the Skyward series. This book has taken us far beyond where I thought we would go in the first book, which I feel like is a common theme with Sanderson. I'm not going to say too much about it because it's the 3rd book in a series, but the 4th one is coming out this year, I think in November, and I'm so excited to finish it out, and it has an orange cover. I'm so excited for the orange cover. I don't know what it is, but I'm very excited for this book. I also gave this book 4 stars. I think the reason that it didn't get bumped up to 5 like the other ones is just because it kind of dragged in the middle. I don't want to talk too specifically about it because if I say too much, it will ruin the adventure from the first 2 books. But I do think it dragged a bit, and that just happens to be, it was just so much longer than the other ones. And while there was more happening, I think it just could have been sped up slightly, especially because this is in the YA area, but I still loved it. I love Spensa. I think she's so funny, and I want to cosplay as her so bad. And I love Mbot. I always love Mbot. But anyway, yeah, I loved it. The last book I'm going to talk about in this little wrap-up video is The Age of Innocence. And this is interesting. This is a very, like a 90-degree turn from a lot of the stuff that I've been reading recently. It's a classic. It won the Pulitzer Prize in, I think, 1920. And as you'll see later, I'm doing a video about the Gilmore Girls reading list, and this kind of is what kicked that off, so I'll wait to get into that for another video, you'll see. But I wanted to read it because I wanted to get back into reading a couple of classics, and I thought this one is really short. I was interested that it was written by a woman, and I've like heard a lot about it, so I was just like, I'll pick this one up. This one could be really interesting. So I picked it up, and I really, really struggled to get through the first 2 chapters, and I thought I was dumb. I thought I was like, why am I too dumb to read this book? I'm not too dumb to read this book. As I've learned, reading difficult text is like using a muscle, and when you don't use that muscle for a while, it gets hard to do again. So as I kept reading the book, it did get easier to read, and it has become easier overall to read more challenging texts since I picked up this book, so I am, no matter what, still glad that I picked it up in that sense. This book basically revolves around a sort of love triangle, but let me put it like this. If Edith Wharton were a man, this book would be ostracized and criticized for the way that the women are written. I can see that there's nuance within that, but I genuinely do think that, because we kind of have this, like, it's basically a guy who can't choose between the good girl that he's engaged to and her very fun manic pixie dream girl cousin, and that's like really what it boils down to. The text was beautiful. It was an interesting story. I did feel for the characters in their own way, but like beyond that, it really wasn't what I wanted it to be. The wife slash, honorable, nice, good girl character, she did have her own agency. She was smart. The main character, the guy, his name's like Newland Archer, he thought he was being sneaky, seeing her cousin Ellen, and that, he could be in love with her and his wife would not figure it out. And she pretty much clearly states to him, like, I know that you're in love with someone else, but I'm still willing to marry you because that's the right thing to do. And he was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I should just be with this other woman. Like, that's like... that was like 90% of the book. And it was interesting, and I am really glad that I read it. I find it interesting the way that Edith talks about America in the late 1800s and Europe in the late 1800s, and like the feuds between them, and the way that like the rich upper class views those other people. If you're someone who's interested in Jane Austen or similar authors about like the class differences, this definitely could be a book for you. But it wasn't anything... I've read a decent amount of classics, and I don't think this one will be in my top 10. Maybe on a reread if I find something in it that I was missing before, but I really do think that the characters were kind of like watered down, specifically the women, and the Archer. I feel like we're supposed to feel for him and want him to be with the woman that he's in love with, but at the end of the day, I just like couldn't care less about the guy, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. So those were all the books that I read in August. Overall, I would say we had some pretty good reads. I was only slightly disappointed like 1 or 2 times, but the rest of it I feel like they were really great books that I would recommend to people. I'm trying to like get through a lot of the series that I've been reading, and so I know I don't want to talk too in depth about a lot of those because I don't want to give spoilers away, but yeah, that was my little wrap up for this month. Let me know what you read in August or what you're looking at reading in September. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. I hope your summer was amazing. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me out so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.